So welcome to another episode of Mind of Adolfo. And today I want to talk about nationalism. And nationalism isn't pride, it's ego in a uniform. And I want you to think about it. Nationalism, right now, for example, the hot button take or the controversial topic would be American exceptionalism, make America great again. Or you hear things like Zionism. Well, what's Zionism? Well, Zionism is Jewish nationalism. And you have a lot of the progressive left protesting an unjust and asymmetrical war that's out of proportion, if you will. And it's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, but I'm not going to discuss that. But I'm going to discuss just nationalism in general, because nationalism teaches you that you are special and they're not. Nationalism, from what I've read historically, you have to dehumanize the others or put your quote unquote national interests first before the well-beings of others. And the national interest is usually expressed through government interest or the populace, whether it be for resources or ideology or whatever the case may be. And this is a lie that started wars, it's fed empires, and it has starved children. So let me give you some of the origins, if you will, of nationalism to give you context. Because today we live and experience and are, for some of us, not all of us, but are the victims of past foreign policies and decisions that were based purely on nationalism. So nationalism is a modern ideology, and this emerged during the French Revolution between the 18th and 19th century. So before the French Revolution, before nationalism, most people identified by their tribe, their religion, or their city, not the nation state. Or even think about your last name. The idea of having a last name was many reasons why we have last names, but just to give you an example, if you're a descendant of Northern Europe and your last name is Johnson or Ragnarsson, that means you are son of, right? You were identified by the son of. In the Middle East, it would be something like Ibn, right? Muhammad Ibn, meaning son of Muhammad, or so it was a patriarch, or in some cases a matriarch, or in some cases your name was associated with the landowner, the person who owned that estate, which is usually someone who was associated with the monarchy, or it was associated with the place. For example, if you knew, John that lived by the river, John Rivers or something of that sort. So again, before nationalism, again, it was purely based on your tribe, your clan, your religion, and your city. And in the French Revolution, it was basically the bourgeois class. So think of the wealthy merchants, all the way down to the serfs or the peasants. And they revolted against the monarchy, and they cut off a lot of heads, to say the least. After that, Napoleon emerged because he needed to put a stop to the quote unquote revolution. So how do you stop a revolution? Well, you tell people that they're the best. This is the first time ever done in history, and you did this because you were French, not because you were from Normandy, or not because you were from Paris, or not because you were a Roman Catholic. No, it's because you're French. So Napoleon used nationalism to fuel expansion, to fuel empire. And he called it the Army of the Republic. And this is where France became an empire. And this was rise of the Napoleonic Wars. And of course, this ideology spread like wildfire. So eventually the Germans caught on, the Russians caught on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? All over Europe. They started developing this idea of the nation state, of nationalism. And this is also a period where, coming into the, say 19th, 20th century, we started industrializing war as well. So the rise of nation states, they turned flags into religions, and they started making anthems and pledges, and of course, military worship. So you're not born into nationalism, you're programmed into it. And it's not culture, it's an engineered identity, and it's often used for war. Again, this is something that, think about it, like the pride of you. What's the difference between a patriot and a nationalist? The patriot can love his country, can love his land, he can love the people in his country, and that's one thing. But to be a nationalist, right? To be a nationalist, to be, exceptional, to be number one, to be better than anyone else. And this idea, again, it's expressed and twisted and bastardized in many ways. It could be done through, again, just sheer, again, just like an example of the French Revolution. We're French, we're the French Republic, the Army of the Republic, or manifest destiny in the United States, right? This is our destiny to take all this land, and we are exceptional. We did something extraordinary in history. Or it could be religious. Again, look at the Jewish state of Israel, right? It's based on messianic prophecies, based on an idea that you are God's chosen people, and this is the land of the Canaanites, is the promised land, and to fulfill these prophecies, we have to bring back all the Jews to the promised land, to bring back, the apocalypse or the end times. And this is also in obviously in Christian theology as well, the book of Revelation. So that's why naturally you have the all Christian right funding organizations like AIPAC and supporting the state of Israel. And call it what you will, but these are done because of belief systems. But then again, you marry a religious mythology, if you will, or things that were stories from the Bible that would be considered allegorical or metaphorical, if you will, and you intertwine it with nationalism. You put a flag on it, and now you have a purpose, a destiny, if you will, as one people, right? And which is, again, it's an absurd thing considering the scope of human history. Most people would identify with, again, with their clan, their region, their tribe, and the language they spoke as well, right? Before there was a concept of the races, people would see the differences in each other by the language they spoke, right? The tribes or the regions that they were from. It wasn't so much of a race thing as much as a language thing. If you look at the Turkish tribes of the steppe, it is a melting pot of people. You'll have blonde hair, blue-eyed, redhead people, along with the more traditional, Turkish, look, more curly-haired, olive-oiled skin, and they never base their differences on how they looked superficially, if you will, right on the surface. It was mostly based on your culture, how you wore your hair, how you rode your horse, the language you spoke, the food you ate, culture, right? So nationalism is a fairly new phenomenon. And to give you some historical conflicts that are rooted in nationalism, they have been the most brutal and the most violent, and again, the ones that consistently give you whole-scale industrialized slaughter. So from 1803 to 1815, we had the Napoleonic Wars, and that gave us approximately 3 to 6 million deaths. Then in 1914 and 1918, we had World War I. And by World War I, all of Europe was nationalized, right? And you had allegiances and allies and so forth. And after the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, that set off a chain of events which caused one of the bloodiest wars in human history, with over 20 million dead. Then, of course, you have World War II, which is a fascinating piece of history, because from 1939 to 1945, in World War II, over 70 million people died. And this was fueled by fascist nationalist ideology, worldwide. You can say that the United States obviously was born in nationalism because it was inspired by the French Revolution, but um, Germany had just a hyper maniacal sense of nationalism, especially after the defeat of World War One, and this idea in German of Blutenboden, right, of blood and soil, that manifests destiny. We have to take back German lands, hence that justify the invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland and France and so forth. And even on the Japanese side, which was heavily influenced by cultural identity tied to Bushido and Shinto and Confucianism, excuse me, that led also to a hyper aggressive, also maniacal, fanatical army that invaded um, the Pacific Islands. They had plans even to invade Australia at one point, Manchuria. They were in Manchuria from China from 1931 all the way up to 1945, essentially. Committed horrible atrocities. The raping of Nanking was one, or Nanjing as it's pronounced. So again, World War II is one I want to cover in depth and detail because it's fascinating, the psychology, the ideology, and the belligerence behind World War II. A more recent one, 1994, the Rwandan genocide. Again, that was also ethnic nationalism, led to 800,000 plus deaths in 100 days. I think within the first 2 days, 100,000, something in the magnitude of the order of 100,000 people died with machetes. And this was the Hutu doing to the Tutsis. And this has colonial origins tied to it, of course, right? After the colonists left, the Tutsis took I guess you could call it the nice administrative cushy roles of society, right? They became the merchant class, the bourgeois class, and I guess the Hutus felt they were second class, inspiring a sense of identity and nationalism. And it's much more complicated history, much more nuanced, and I'm doing it justice, but just to give you an idea of the hate and violence that nationalism can inflict. Now, usually these things, again, always happen, like nationalism. You start rising during economic insecurity. So you can look at the United States right now. We've had, after COVID-19, a lot of up and downs with our economy, with the stock market, and a lot of fear mongering. And it's always weaponized. And historically, they always marginalized the most vulnerable, the most feeble people in society. And that correlates with xenophobia, militarism, and of course, authoritarianism, as we're witnessing, before our very eyes. So they did a Pew study in 2023. Countries with high nationalist sentiment show lower trust in international cooperation and democratic institutions. So nationalism kills. It just wears a different uniform each time. So from Caesar to Hitler to MAGA, it's always one tribe, one flag, one myth. Now, give you some facts here. These are my personal views on nationalism. I'm sure someone out there on with a YouTube channel or some professor in some prestigious university might disagree with me, but these are just my personal views that are based on accurate historical context. So, but let me give you one stat here. So the world produces enough food to feed 10 billion people, and that's in other words, twice the global population, right? And 800 million people go hungry each year. There's approximately tens of thousands of children who are forced into child labor, especially in agriculture, or, for example, cobalt mining in the Congo in Africa, or textiles. And over $427 billion is lost yearly through corporate tax havens, right? So the Cayman Islands and things like this. So what I want to say is that we built these walls, these imaginary borders, and we plant flags, and we declare we're the best, and we sing the national anthem, and we build it around abundance. while everyone else is locked out and starving. And to me, that's not security. That's hoarding with the flag. Now, that's just a shame, if you will, right? I know it sounds very, um, I guess, naive and credulous to think you're going to have one world order or one world government, if you will. And I don't think that's what I'm advocating. And I don't think I have the answers to what that would be and what that would look like. But I think something like the UN is a good start. You know, you have United Nations where you have international law. You try to bring in as many countries as you can, and you have international courts. And I think you could structure that or make an architecture all the way down to, you know, your local municipal courts, if you will, right, with your own local laws and based on local laws, customs, idiosyncrasies, and things of that sort, where we don't have to sacrifice, you know, your cultural identity, if you will, or your individual identity if you live in the West, but you set norms and expectations and laws that universally govern all of humanity. Okay. Today, I think it's turning into something else. I think it's turning into a global feudal order. So look at the structural reality of some of these mega corporations, right? They extract natural resources, things like gold, lithium, cobalt, in poor nations. And they pay little or no taxes to these nations. Obviously, they, you know, paid little or no tax by paying off the government officials, creating corruption, creating chaos and turmoil and instability, because again, that justifies you're taking and keeping the status quo, if you will. Often they'll do these leases, for example, like Malaysia with China as an example, right? They'll do 50 to 100-year leases to take their ports, or China does this in Central America as well, right? They'll give them loans and they'll leverage that because they know it's impossible to pay back in order to use a resource or something that they want, and they'll lease it for just an exaggerated amount of time. And then you have wealth extracted from local environment, and the local environment is destroyed, and there's never any reinvestment, right? And again, they cloak and hide behind mega corporations and nationalism and the laws, if you will, that are behind those borders. I'll give you some examples. Cobalt mines in the Congo, as I mentioned, that fuels Tesla, Apple, Samsung, and often with child labor. Banana republics, Guatemala, Honduras, were controlled by the U.S. companies like United Fruit. Other companies, Amazon, Apple, ExxonMobil, they pay nearly 0% in tax while public services crumble. And then we have the EV and green industries that still rely on exploiting the global South. So that to me isn't capitalism, it's conquest in a suit. And it's just a new form of feudalism. And I don't think feudalism ever died. It just hired PR firms. And it told the people, you are an American or you're a Canadian or you are a German or a French, you're exceptional, you're the best, you created civilization. And again, you have these barons that are hiding behind borders and these laws that are written to benefit one party or are written with a specific, malign intention, if you will. Not every single law, that's a over generalization, but you have to look at the state of the world today. So imagine if we evolved. Imagine if solar's cheaper, right, than fossil fuel. And that's over 70% of the world. Or we've started doing regenerative agriculture that could cut emissions by, say 10 to 15% if it's scaled. They have a Project Drawdown, right? Start investing in homes, in health, and maybe with more economic stability, providing shelter and food for people, maybe we wouldn't have to invest so much into security. Universal basic education for all children globally. That would cost approximately $39 billion a year. That's less than the US military spends in 1 week to educate the whole world to make them literate. Because they won't, if you educate the world, you won't have as many credulous people, right? It's not that people are stupid, right? Sometimes we jump to conclusions and we say, well, why do these people believe this? Why do, Salafis believe in jihad, as an example, right? Why would they blow themselves up, or why would they do that? We have to look at the socioeconomic conditions that led to that. You have to look at the lack of education and literacy that led to these events. The governments they live in, for example, it may be North Korea or China, where they limit the information you can do. You're compartmentalized to one thing. So educating the world, providing shelter and food for the world, providing universal basic health care for the world, having an open border system with economic equality. This is not an anti-capitalist rant. Capitalism is good. It's feudalism and monopolies that are bad. So practice some conscious capitalism where, no, you don't have to excessively tax the revenues of companies, but maybe you could tax individuals and reinvest that back into our communities and make it a global community. Instead of this idea of conquest right now, where, example, again, Russia, Ukraine, Russia with their heroes of the, World War II, and they were originally the Kievan Rus, and the origins of Russia started in Kiev. But I wonder how much the average Russian knows the origins of, the Kievan Rus and who they were basically these mercenaries and warlords from Scandinavia that went to the Slavic nations to trade, and along the way they were, enslaving people and trading fur and slaves in these markets. They were hired again as mercenary soldier security, and they just, again, they killed their masters and lorded over the people, and then became, obviously through a long history, it became into what is Russia today. And again, the sense of national identity cuts so many nuances that are not accounted for in the actual history of things. Okay. So, and give you some, I guess, to do on a side tangent here, right? Religion is always, again, it's individually or communally, if practiced in a, I'm not looking for the word here, not in a way that it separates church and state and governance, if you will, right? Which is, again, another topic I want to touch on, because you can look at, again, historically Jewish communities that the Torah and the Talmud are essentially laws to govern the community, and they walk hand in hand. And you could sort of apply that to the state of Israel today in some of the political parties, but not to harp on that too much. However, I want to give you a little statistic here. Over 40% of Gen Z identifies as spiritual but not religious. So that always tells me that human beings, even if they're, hardcore atheists, it seems like we need a sort of framework, hierarchical architect, if you will, with a Godhead or a leader or a vision or something to keep us moving forward. And when we take out religion or we take out monarchies, we call it what you will, nationalism, right? The idea that this piece of land with these imaginary borders, that people confined to these borders that don't actually exist in the real world, are superior, better, or smarter by basically the universal lottery that it was that you were born in this specific region or place or area. It has nothing to do with anything that you did personally. It was just by luck you were born there. And I find that insane. I find all of this insane. All ideologies, for the most part, or are explanations about the world, your place in the world, and how the world should work. Instead of like this breaking it down to its smallest denominator, to the most common denominator, or the simplest form, which would be, food, safety, shelter, which is what every human needs. So, again, what if food and healthcare and education weren't privileges, but birthrights? And what if we stopped drawing borders and started drawing a blueprint for a better future? And a lot of that has to do with letting go of our egos that are tied to our ideologies, our identities, our belief systems. And you can have a personal belief and you can be proud of your family, your clan, your tribe, your culture. But it's not the only culture, right? It's not the only way of being. There's many ways of being. So the future doesn't need nationalism. In my opinion, it needs humanity. I'm going to say something controversial. Let's burn the flags. Let's burn all the flags. Let's feed the world. Be human. And maybe that's the next revolution. So if you want to fix the world, we need to start by tearing down the myths that divide it. So I hope you guys found this compelling, informative. If you like, hit the like and subscribe button. If you disagree, go ahead and leave a comment. Tell me your thoughts, your ideas, your feelings about this. And like always, I'm going to leave you guys with, remember to lift more, eat more, rest more, love more, hate less. Thank you.